The Boeing 777 sliced through the night sky smoothly, leaving a thin trail in the dark. The flight had taken off from London, headed for New York, filled with distinguished passengers and important figures from the global stage. Among them was David Miller, an American diplomat on a crucial mission. He sat comfortably in first class, reviewing the final details of his presentation for the peace summit that would take place in a few days. The negotiations were sensitive, involving the future of relations between two nations on the brink of a catastrophic conflict. In first class, everything seemed normal. The low hum of conversations between passengers, the faint clinking of glasses with drinks, and the constant movement of the flight attendants painted a serene picture. David gazed out the window, watching the clouds illuminated by the moon as he reflected on the importance of his presence at the negotiation. He knew his role would be decisive in avoiding a global disaster. As the hours passed, the cabin atmosphere remained calm. Passengers started to doze off or get lost in books and movies. David, however, remained focused, anxious about the responsibility he carried. His mind was far from the luxurious cabin. He barely noticed when the airplane's soft lights flickered slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if it were just an electrical glitch. But then, the intercom in the main cabin emitted a sharp tone, followed by sudden silence. David frowned, looking around. Conversations had stopped. Something felt off. One of the flight attendants hurried down the aisle, with a tense expression that contrasted with the calm atmosphere of mere moments before. The diplomat adjusted in his seat, his political instincts sensing something was wrong. Before he could even stand to ask what was happening, the emergency doors near the cockpit burst open. Armed men, dressed in dark clothes and masks, suddenly appeared. In the blink of an eye, the serene atmosphere inside the plane turned into chaos. The men stormed into the cabin, ordering the flight attendants away from the doors. One of them, clearly the leader, positioned himself in the middle of the aisle and, with a controlled, precise movement, showed what appeared to be a remote detonator. His voice rang out loud and firm, breaking the heavy silence that hung in the air. "This plane is now under our control. Don't try to be heroes. Do exactly what we say, and no one gets hurt." David's heart raced. He quickly realized that the target of this hijacking wasn't random. He felt a chill down his spine as he thought this could be connected to his mission. Without moving a muscle, his eyes locked on the hijackers. The leader's voice echoed through the aisles, demanding everyone's attention while the passengers looked on in panic, struggling to understand what was happening. The tension was palpable. The hijackers swiftly took control of key points in the cabin, immobilizing any potential reaction. David knew the situation was delicate. Any wrong move could result in tragedy. He remained silent, analyzing the hijackers' next step. The leader continued with his instructions, informing them that they were demanding the release of a highly dangerous political prisoner. If their demands weren't met within 12 hours, they'd blow up the plane. David felt a knot forming in his stomach. There was no telling what would happen next, but one thing was certain: the flight that was supposed to take him to the peace summit had now turned into a nightmare. David remained seated, watching every movement of the hijackers with close attention. The silence inside the cabin was suffocating. Every passenger, frozen in fear, avoided making any sudden move. The hijackers walked slowly through the aisles, taking control of all strategic points. David was trying to think, searching for an understanding of the real intentions behind the hijacking. Though the demands were clear, he knew there was always something more at play in situations like this. While the hijackers' leader kept the passengers in check, a woman in economy class was closely observing their every move. Lauren Evans, a CIA agent, was undercover as an ordinary passenger on this flight. Her true mission had been to monitor a suspicious figure on board, but the hijacking had completely derailed her plans. Now, in addition to her original mission, Lauren found herself facing a far more dangerous situation than she had anticipated. She knew she had to act carefully. Any wrong move could cost dozens of lives. As she analyzed the hijackers, she looked for patterns, attempts at communication, or any clue that might give her an advantage. Her years of training told her that something else would soon be revealed. This wasn't just about a prisoner exchange, there was something bigger happening. She had to find out what. The hijackers spoke among themselves in a language Lauren recognized as Arabic. They moved with military precision, indicating a well-executed plan. One of them seemed to be in charge of the cockpit, while the leader kept his eyes on the first-class passengers. It was obvious that David Miller was the center of their interest. Lauren knew she had to find a way to get closer to him, but any attempt to communicate could raise suspicion. Time was not on her side. From his seat, David was also noticing the hijackers' movements, but something else was bothering him deeply. It wasn't just the hijackers that caught his attention. A man sitting nearby seemed agitated, different from the rest of the passengers. He wore formal clothes and kept his eyes fixed on the leader, as if waiting for something to happen. David began to wonder if this man was somehow involved in the plan. He was the only one who appeared to know more than he let on. The tension inside the plane continued to rise. The leader of the hijackers, with his firm and controlled voice, announced over the plane's communication system their demands once more. This time, there was a hint of impatience. They wanted the immediate release of Zayed Khalil, a notorious prisoner with ties to international terrorist groups. If Khalil wasn't freed within 12 hours, the lives of everyone on board would be at risk. The fate of the passengers now depended on a political decision that seemed unlikely. Meanwhile, Lauren was still keeping a close eye on everything. She had a secondary mission on this flight, something that was flying under the radar even for the CIA. There was a supposed businessman on board, Michael Hudson, who had become of special interest to the agency. His connections to the illegal arms trade had caught their attention, and Lauren had been tasked with monitoring him. However, with the hijacking underway, everything had become more complicated. Now, she had to decide whether her focus should be on the hijacking or on her original mission. David, on the other hand, was feeling the weight of responsibility in his hands. He knew his position as a diplomat made him a valuable target, but he also understood that revealing any information could worsen the situation. His instinct told him that there was more to this than just a demand for Khalil's release. The hijackers knew too much, and David needed to figure out how to protect himself and help the other passengers without falling into the traps the criminals had set. Lauren remained alert. She knew she would need to make a move soon, but every action had to be carefully calculated. The hijackers were dividing their attention between the passengers and controlling the plane, which gave her a slight advantage. As the tension rose, the CIA agent planned her next steps. Every second was crucial. The following hours dragged on, and the pressure inside the plane increased with each passing minute. The hijackers maintained an oppressive silence, patrolling the aisles and watching everyone's movements closely. David could feel the weight of time. The 12-hour deadline set by the hijackers felt like an invisible ticking bomb, ready to go off at any moment. The calm outside the airplane was a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside. David's thoughts wandered to the negotiations happening on the ground. He knew the chances of Zayed Khalil's release were slim to none. The authorities would not easily give in to demands like these, especially given Khalil's violent past. However, the situation on board was unpredictable, and David couldn't dismiss the possibility that a diplomatic maneuver might be in the works to buy them time. Time was all they had. As David silently pondered, Lauren, the CIA agent, moved strategically. She knew she had to be quick, but discreet. She was aware that these hijackers were no amateurs. The precise way they controlled the situation indicated military training. They weren't just ordinary terrorists but a highly organized group with logistical support and detailed information about who was on this flight. This made her even more suspicious. On the ground, international authorities were also scrambling to understand the full scope of the hijacking. Communication lines were open, but contact with the plane was minimal. The aircraft had been redirected to an unknown route, and the hijackers were unwilling to reveal any more details about their plan. The U.S. government faced an impossible decision: release a highly dangerous prisoner or risk the lives of over 200 people on board. The pressure was mounting on the White House as special forces prepared for a potential rescue operation. Back on the plane, David continued observing the hijackers' behavior. Something seemed to be changing. He noticed small, almost imperceptible signals between them, but they were clearly coordinated. As a diplomat, David had learned to read people, and something about their behavior suggested that things were about to escalate. He looked again at the man he had previously suspected, the supposed businessman Michael Hudson. Hudson remained uneasy, heightening David's suspicions. Lauren was also keeping a close eye on Hudson. He had been her original mission, and now, with the new crisis unfolding, she wondered how deep his involvement went. Michael Hudson didn't seem like just another hostage. He knew more than any ordinary passenger. The way he looked at the hijackers, almost as if waiting for a cue, made Lauren even more suspicious. She knew there was more going on than just the demand for Khalil's release. Suddenly, the leader of the hijackers spoke again through the plane's communication system. His voice, still firm, carried a new note of impatience. He repeated their demands, but this time, he added something new. He warned that if negotiations didn't progress soon, they would begin executing passengers. The threat was clear. The plane, now flying over a conflict zone in the Middle East, was more vulnerable than ever. With each word from the leader, the panic among the passengers grew. Lauren knew she had to act quickly. She had to find a way to intervene before the situation spiraled completely out of control. But her focus was divided. Michael Hudson remained a critical piece of the puzzle, and more, she felt he played a larger role in the crisis than he was letting on. Time was running out, and the tension in the air was almost tangible. David could also feel the growing anxiety. He knew that high-level negotiations were likely happening on the ground, but up in the air, any misstep could lead to irreversible tragedy. He needed to find out what was behind Hudson's behavior. Somehow, David felt that this man was the key to understanding the hijackers' real plan. As time continued to slip away, each minute on the plane felt like an eternity. The hijackers remained silent, maintaining control, but something had shifted in the air. The leader's movements had changed. He was pacing more nervously down the aisles, and David noticed it. His instincts told him that the hijackers weren't as composed as they appeared. They knew something bigger was at stake, and David was starting to suspect that Michael Hudson was at the center of this sudden change. Lauren, on the other hand, had already made her decision. She had to confront Hudson. Every move he made was calculated, as if he were waiting for the right moment, but not to escape. He seemed to know something that no one else did. She watched him from afar, her eyes fixed on him as the plane continued its unstable course. The only question left was how she could act without drawing attention. If the hijackers realized what was happening, everyone on board would be at risk. Hudson, still seated in first class, calmly observed the movements around him. His eyes, hidden behind a mask of neutrality, followed the hijackers' every step. He knew his moment was approaching, but he showed no signs of fear or desperation, unlike the other passengers. At that moment, he briefly turned, and his eyes met David's. In that brief exchange, David realized the truth. Hudson wasn't just a hostage. There was something more, a connection with the hijackers that he was trying to conceal. Lauren decided she couldn't wait any longer. In a split second, she discreetly stood up and made her way down the aisle. With silent, calculated steps, she walked toward the first-class bathroom, intentionally passing close to Hudson. As she passed, she dropped a small pen she had been carrying, something insignificant at first glance. Hudson looked at the fallen object, and a slight change crossed his face. He knew it was a signal. Inside the bathroom, Lauren shut the door and took a deep breath. Her suspicions were confirmed. Hudson wasn't just another passenger, and he seemed deeply involved in the hijackers' plan. However, she still needed more proof before making her move. Using her small, hidden communication device, she tried to connect with the CIA base, but the frequencies were blocked. The situation was even more complicated than she had imagined. Back in the cabin, David continued to observe Hudson's behavior closely. Something about the way he had reacted to Lauren's dropped pen had made David even more suspicious. Hudson hadn't hesitated for a second, and now his eyes were fixed on the front of the plane, as if waiting for a command. David knew he had to do something, but his options were limited. He was unarmed and surrounded by armed hijackers, but he needed to uncover more about who Hudson really was. The tension inside the plane was growing unbearable. The passengers looked nervously at one another as the hijackers continued to maintain rigid control. Suddenly, the hijackers' leader received a call on his radio. He stepped back toward the rear of the plane, where he began a conversation in Arabic. Lauren, still in the bathroom, could hear fragments of the conversation. Although she couldn't understand everything, one word stood out clearly: Hudson. Her heart raced. Hudson wasn't just a hostage, he was directly involved in the plan. It was the confirmation she needed, but now, the question was how to act without endangering the passengers. Lauren left the bathroom calmly, returning to her seat. As she passed Hudson again, she noticed a slight shift in his posture. He knew he had been discovered. Before Lauren could make a move, Hudson stood up. He walked toward the hijackers' leader, who was still at the back of the plane. Lauren followed discreetly, observing from a distance. What she heard next confirmed her worst fears. Hudson had been the inside man, the internal link connecting the hijackers to the rest of the operation. He wasn't just an informant, he had been part of the plan from the very beginning. The agent knew she was now in a race against time. If Hudson realized she was onto him, he could alert the hijackers and put everyone at risk. But she also knew she couldn't just stand by. The fate of everyone on board rested on the shoulders of someone who had betrayed not only the passengers but also the government. Time seemed to drip through the walls of the airplane like sand through an hourglass. Every second mattered, and Lauren knew the margin for error was razor thin. As Hudson and the leader of the hijackers exchanged quiet words at the back of the plane, she felt the urgency to act, but the situation was too delicate for a rash move. She knew every step had to be calculated to the millimeter. The stakes were simply too high. The hijackers were already showing signs of strain. After speaking with Hudson, the leader returned to the front of the aircraft, but his demeanor had changed. Something was bothering him, perhaps a delay in negotiations or the lack of an immediate response regarding the release of Zayed Khalil. The tension was building, and things were beginning to unravel. David, now fully convinced that Hudson was a critical player in the plan, started piecing things together but still didn't know how he could use this information without putting everyone in even more danger. The tension inside the plane was reaching a breaking point. Passengers, who had remained silent until now, were starting to show signs of panic. Murmurs spread among them, and the idea that something terrible was about to happen hung in the air like a storm cloud. The clock seemed relentless, the countdown to the hijackers' 12-hour deadline was no longer just an abstract threat. It loomed over every passenger's head. David, despite the growing pressure, knew he couldn't simply sit and watch. He needed more information, and Hudson was the key. As the fake businessman returned to his seat, David observed his every move, every gesture. He noticed Hudson was hiding something in the inner pocket of his jacket, something small he tried to conceal. David's suspicions were confirmed when he caught a glimpse of something metallic. Hudson was armed with more than just information. Meanwhile, Lauren was trying to inch closer to the cockpit, where the hijackers were now clustered. She couldn't confront Hudson directly, not yet, but she had to do something to prevent the detonator, or whatever device he carried, from being used. The threat of an explosion or a coordinated attack was moments away from becoming reality. At the front of the plane, the leader of the hijackers, now visibly irritated, grabbed the cockpit microphone and made a new announcement. His voice was firm, but there was a note of impatience that hadn't been there before. "If we don't receive a response soon, we will begin executing passengers. Khalil's release is non-negotiable. Your time is running out." Panic spread through the passengers like wildfire. The word execution pushed the already tense atmosphere to a new level of fear. David felt the chill run down his spine. He knew the U.S. government would be reluctant to give in to such demands, which meant the hijackers' threat was very real. Any delay, and lives would be lost. Lauren, hearing the announcement, knew time had become an even more ruthless enemy. She had to do something. Watching the hijackers closely, she noticed a brief moment of distraction as two of them argued about the imminent execution. Seizing the moment, Lauren moved closer to Hudson, close enough to get a look at what he was hiding in his jacket. She confirmed it: Hudson was carrying a detonator. But now, with time running out and executions about to begin, Lauren knew that any attempt to disarm the plan required the utmost precision. The government was likely negotiating on the ground, trying to buy time, but up here, the environment was a pressure cooker ready to explode. If she made the wrong move, everything could go up in flames. Hudson, for his part, seemed to be waiting for the perfect moment. His eyes no longer showed panic but a calculated sense of anticipation. He knew exactly what he was doing. And that was the problem. He wouldn't act until it was too late, and Lauren couldn't let that happen. David felt the same weight on his shoulders. He knew the situation was on the verge of collapse, and somehow, he would have to intervene. The problem was how. He looked at Hudson again, then at the silent figure of the CIA agent, who by now was moving closer to her target. David knew that any mistake could cost not just his life but the lives of everyone on board. The clock kept ticking mercilessly. The plane continued on its course, but now every minute was a race against time. Lauren knew the moment of confrontation with Hudson was drawing near. The hijacker leader had already issued the final warning, and everyone on board knew what was at stake. Executions were no longer a distant threat. Lauren had to act, and fast. The device Hudson carried, the detonator hidden in his jacket, was the trigger that could end everything. The CIA agent moved carefully, calculating every step. She still didn't know how much the hijackers trusted Hudson, but it was clear that he played a crucial role in the plan. Authorities on the ground hadn't given in to the demands, and the hijacker leader, impatient, was now preparing to escalate the situation to its deadly next phase. Lauren needed to disarm Hudson before he had a chance to use the detonator, but the approach had to be swift and precise. One mistake would mean the end. David, observing everything closely, could sense the mounting tension. The hijackers paced up and down the aisle, restless. The leader was barking orders into the radio, his voice filled with frustration. David knew the negotiations were not going well. The U.S. government wouldn't easily release Syed Khalil, which meant the hijackers were likely ready to move to the next step, and Hudson was at the center of it. Suddenly, Lauren decided it was time to act. With quiet precision, she approached Hudson, who was momentarily distracted. In one swift motion, she grabbed his arm and, before he could react, pushed him against the seat. Caught off guard, Hudson tried to resist, but Lauren, trained for high-stakes situations, acted with skill. Within seconds, she managed to partially immobilize him, but she knew the confrontation was far from over. Hudson struggled to break free, and his sudden movements began to attract the attention of the hijackers. One of them noticed the commotion and, shouting in Arabic, ran toward them. Lauren knew time was running out. She needed to disarm Hudson before the hijackers fully understood what was happening. Her fingers quickly searched his jacket until they found the detonator. But Hudson wasn't giving up that easily. In a final burst of effort, he shoved Lauren aside, regaining some control. In his mind, he knew that if he pressed the button, he could end it all. But something held him back, maybe the presence of the hijackers, who were now closing in to see what was going on. David, watching the scene unfold, realized he had to help. He knew he wasn't a trained agent, but he also knew that any hesitation could be fatal. Without thinking twice, he quickly got up from his seat and ran toward the struggle. Lauren, now losing control of the situation, glanced at David. He threw himself at Hudson, trying to pin down the arm holding the detonator. The hijackers, confused by the fight breaking out before them, began shouting at one another. The leader, realizing what was happening, rushed toward the group, but Lauren had already regained part of the upper hand. With David's help, she finally managed to disarm Hudson, tearing the detonator from his grip. But the hijacker leader was now upon them. The atmosphere inside the plane was pure chaos. Passengers screamed, unsure of what was happening. Lauren, with the detonator in hand, tried to stand, but the hijacker leader knocked her down with a violent blow. David, still dazed from the struggle, looked at the leader, knowing that the situation was about to escalate further. The fight with Hudson had drawn everyone's attention, and now the hijacker leader was determined to regain control. But then, something unexpected happened. One of the younger hijackers, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. He looked at the leader, then at Lauren lying on the floor, and hesitated. His eyes filled with doubt. It was clear he wasn't fully committed to the plan. That moment of hesitation was all Lauren needed. With a swift movement, she stood up and, before the hijacker leader could react, pushed him back. The fight that followed was intense, but Lauren was determined. The young hijacker, still hesitant, watched the scene without intervening, as if he were reconsidering his role in the plan. David, still nearby, watched in silence. He knew the situation was teetering on the edge of complete collapse, but something about the young hijacker's hesitation gave him a glimmer of hope. Maybe, with the right intervention, they could still turn things around. The fight raged on. The hijacker leader, furious, fought with all his strength, but Lauren, driven by the need to protect the passengers, didn't back down. The confrontation reached its climax when, in a final effort, Lauren managed to pin him down, trapping his arms and forcing him to the ground. The plane, now engulfed in tense silence, watched as the scene unfolded. The young hijacker, now completely uncertain of his role, took another step forward. His eyes met Lauren's, and something inside him changed. Maybe it was the pressure, or the realization that he had been part of something far beyond his control. He approached and, with a trembling voice, said in Arabic to the leader, "It's over. We can't go on like this." The chaotic scene began to give way to a strange truce. The plane seemed frozen in time, every eye locked on the tension unfolding in the first-class aisle. The young hijacker, after his moment of hesitation, lowered his weapon. He looked at the leader lying on the floor, his eyes revealing the uncertainty he had kept hidden until now. The hijacker leader, still pinned down by Lauren, glared at him with fury, unable to believe what was happening. A betrayal within his own ranks was something he hadn't anticipated. Lauren, breathing heavily, remained tense from the fight but knew the real battle wasn't over yet. She had neutralized the leader and disarmed Hudson, but the plane was still in danger. There was another device, something more that the hijackers had hidden and that could still bring the plane down. She looked at the young hijacker, realizing that he was her only chance to locate the last obstacle before it was too late. "Is there another bomb?" Lauren asked firmly. The young hijacker hesitated, looking around, as if weighing whether he should reveal what he knew. Finally, he nodded, his face a mix of fear and regret. "It's hidden in the cockpit, set to explode in less than an hour if it's not disarmed," he said, his voice trembling in Arabic. Lauren knew time was running out. David, still nearby, felt the atmosphere in the cabin grow heavier. A new wave of panic swept through the passengers as they overheard the conversation. The threat wasn't over, and now, with the countdown nearing its final moments, desperation filled the air once again. David looked at Lauren, who was focused on finding the exact location of the bomb. They would have to work together, or the worst-case scenario would become reality. Without wasting a second, Lauren ordered the young hijacker to take her to where the bomb was hidden. Reluctantly, he began walking slowly toward the cockpit, his eyes constantly glancing back at the leader, who remained on the floor, furious and defeated. "Can you disarm it?" Lauren asked as they walked. The hijacker nodded, though his voice shook slightly when he answered. Inside the cockpit, the space was tight and claustrophobic. The pilot and co-pilot were tied up, but alive. Lauren quickly assessed the situation, then turned to the young hijacker. He pointed to a hidden compartment behind the control panel. The bomb was cleverly concealed, blending in with the machinery, but visible to someone who knew what to look for. The clock was ticking down, and Lauren knew any mistake in disarming it could be fatal. She turned to the hijacker, who now seemed visibly nervous, his hands trembling as he knelt to work on the device. "You've got to trust me," he said, his voice low but sincere. Lauren stared at him firmly, knowing she had no other choice. There wasn't enough time for second-guessing. David, watching from outside the cockpit, tried to keep the passengers calm. He knew there wasn't much he could do beyond waiting for the outcome. The tension was palpable as Lauren and the young hijacker worked together. The leader of the hijackers, still restrained by another passenger who had stepped in to help, continued muttering threats in Arabic, but his power over the situation had evaporated. Meanwhile, the young hijacker explained each wire, each circuit, with a precision that surprised Lauren. He knew the device well, but there was a nervousness in his movements. "I'm afraid to do this," he admitted quietly, as if battling his own fears, but he kept moving forward. Lauren knew that any hesitation now could mean the end, so she encouraged him, keeping her voice steady. Finally, the hijacker reached the critical point. The device was set to explode in less than 5 minutes. It was a complex mechanism, but there was a way to disarm it if the correct code was entered. The hijacker's hands shook as he typed the sequence, his fingers trembling over the buttons. Lauren, though nervous, kept her composure. David, from a distance, barely breathed as he waited for any sign of success. A click. The panel flickered. The countdown stopped. The silence inside the cockpit was deafening. The young hijacker had successfully disarmed the bomb. The immediate threat had been neutralized, and Lauren allowed herself a brief moment of relief, though she knew many questions remained unanswered. The plane was safe for now, but the trauma of this flight would be forever imprinted on everyone there. Lauren looked at the young hijacker, who now seemed relieved but exhausted. He had saved the lives of everyone on board, even though he had started that day on the other side of the fight. "What happens now?" he asked, looking at Lauren with heavy eyes, as if he had no idea what to expect next. Lauren took a deep breath, knowing his future was uncertain. Outside the cockpit, David knew there was still more to be resolved, but for now, the chaos had given way to survival. They still needed to land, and the hijacker leader's fate was yet to be determined, but for now, the plane and its passengers had escaped imminent catastrophe. The silence that filled the cabin after the bomb was disarmed felt strange and heavy, as if no one knew quite how to process what had just happened. Lauren, now exhausted, allowed herself a deeper breath. The immediate danger had been neutralized, but she knew the mission wasn't fully over. The plane was still in the air, and the hijacker's fate had to be dealt with. David, still watching from a distance, tried to calm the other passengers. The panic had subsided, but the trauma was etched on everyone's faces. The whispers of anxiety continued as people tried to make sense of the situation. However, with the bomb disarmed and the hijackers subdued, there was a collective sense that the worst was behind them. The pilots, tied up and visibly shaken, were freed. Lauren, still maintaining her composure, quickly informed them of the situation and directed them to initiate an emergency landing. They immediately complied, adjusting the course toward the nearest military airfield. The plane was now heading for a secure runway, far from the original route but still within the danger zone where the hijackers had planned their attack. During the descent, Lauren kept a close watch on the young hijacker, who now sat silently, clearly shaken by everything that had happened. He made no attempt to escape or resist, as if he already knew his fate was sealed. The leader of the hijackers, still pinned down, continued to glare at everyone around him, but his threats were now empty. He had lost the control he had wielded throughout the flight. David sat back down, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. He had never imagined that his diplomatic trip would place him in the middle of such a dangerous plot. Now, as the plane began its descent, he wondered what awaited him on the ground. His mission's future was uncertain, but for now, all that mattered was landing safely. The plane touched down with a light jolt, and the passengers erupted in applause, their relief palpable. Though the trauma lingered, the overwhelming feeling of survival took over the cabin. The aircraft stopped on a military runway surrounded by special forces already waiting for them. Within minutes, the plane was surrounded, and the remaining hijackers were removed under heavy security. The young hijacker surrendered without resistance, while the leader was dragged away, still shouting in Arabic, promising vengeance. Lauren stayed on board for a moment, watching the scene unfold from the doorway. She knew the report she would have to write would be long and complicated, but her work wasn't quite done. Michael Hudson's role in the betrayal was something she still needed to unravel fully. He had been taken into custody, but his deep involvement in the plot still left many unanswered questions. Lauren also knew that the capture of the hijacker leader was only the beginning of something much bigger. David stepped off the plane with the other passengers, still processing everything. As he set foot on solid ground, he felt a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. He was safe, but the future of his diplomatic mission now seemed unclear. The political fallout from this event would be enormous, and he knew he would face difficult questions once he arrived in New York. Still, he was grateful to be alive. As the hijackers were led away, one of the Special Forces agents involved in the operation approached Lauren. "We've gathered some initial intel from the leader. It seems like this plan was just the start. There's something bigger in motion, but we're still trying to piece it together," he said, his tone serious. Lauren listened quietly, her suspicions confirmed. Back inside the plane, still restrained and furious, the hijacker leader finally fell silent. He was loaded into a van, heading toward Special Forces custody. But as he was being taken away, he received a call on one of the confiscated phones. The voice on the other end of the line, calm and controlled, said just one sentence: "Don't worry. Everything is going according to plan." This was only the beginning. The hijacker leader, though defeated, smiled slightly upon hearing the message. The real plan was still in motion, and the pieces would continue to fall into place even without him. From a distance, Lauren observed, feeling that something still lingered in the air. She knew her work was far from finished.